This night was not independence, it was judgment. July 4th, 1822, Charleston, South Carolina. The harbor answered the sky with thunder, cannon reports rolling like distant drums as fireworks burst into blood-red and bone-white blossoms. The city shouted freedom until its throat went hoarse. But freedom did not cross the threshold of the Middleton estate. It stopped at the gate and turned its face away. Lanterns blazed along the veranda, throwing honeyed light across trimmed hedges and the hard faces of men in linen and polished boots. 12 masters gathered there, planters, merchants, militiamen, swearing the republic would last forever. They laughed with open mouths and closed hearts. Every glass they raised to liberty rang like iron in the ears of those who served them. In the kitchen, a brick furnace sealed with heat, Samuel worked as if carved from patience. His apron clung to him, damp with sweat. His hands moved in measured arcs, basting the pig, turning the corn cakes, lifting lids from iron pots to let breath hiss out like a warning. They did not see him. They saw a back, a shadow, a pair of steady hands that never trembled. But Samuel's quiet was not emptiness. It was a rope pulled tight across years. Patriotic hymns drifted through the doorway, spiked with laughter and the scrape of chairs. Samuel heard something else layered beneath, the small, smothered sounds memory makes, his mother's cough, his child's cry cut short, his wife's name swallowed by a bill of sale. The night tasted of smoke, salt, and things that once had names. A rocket screamed upward and burst, powder scattering like seeds across the dark. On the veranda, the 12 clinked goblets to liberty, to Charleston, their voices sailing over the fields like a curse stitched to the wind. Samuel pinched bitter herbs between finger and thumb and whispered to them as elders once had, "Work clean, work quiet." The leaves answered with their smell, sharp, green, and grave cold. He folded the mixture into sauces that glistened like praise. He glazed the meat until it shone like a promise. He set the wine to breathe. Everything had its place, the platters, the decanter, the reckoning. Outside, fireworks wrote lies across the sky. Inside, the house filled with the comfort of a feast and the certainty of a verdict. Before dawn, 12 voices would falter and fall. Charleston would remember this night not for the color it painted the heavens, but for the color that drained from the faces of men who toasted freedom and choked on judgment. Charleston in July was a furnace no wind could cool. The air clung to the skin like wet cloth, thick with salt from the harbor and the stench of sweat rising from fields worked without pause. The Middleton plantation, like so many others stitched into the Carolina lowcountry, seemed from a distance a vision of order. Neat rows of rice paddies stretching into the horizon, a grand white house with tall columns gleaming in lantern light, gardens trimmed with a surgeon's care. But step closer and the polish gave way to rot. The fields moaned with cicadas and bent backs, bare feet pressed into muck until skin split raw. The overseer's whistle cut through the humidity like a blade, followed by the crack of leather against flesh. Rice swayed where water pooled, but the reflection in the paddies was not of liberty's promise. It was of faces hollowed by hunger, shoulders hunched by unending toil. The big house readied itself for celebration, its windows glowing with candlelight, its floors polished to a shine that could blind. In the quarters, however, shadows gathered. Rough cabins leaned into each other, patched with moss and desperation. Inside, whispers traveled quicker than fire. The masters were toasting freedom tonight, 12 of them, their laughter ready to drown out every cry ever buried in the soil. Some slaves muttered prayers, others bit their tongues until they tasted iron. Smells carried the truth of the day. Roasting meat from the kitchen rolled over the estate, rich and heavy, mingling with the sour tang of sweat soaked into shirts. Smoke from lanterns curled above the veranda like ghostly signals, as if the land itself tried to warn of what was brewing. The rhythm of labor had not paused for the nation's birthday. Even as the guests arrived in wagons, slaves ferried buckets of water, split logs for the kitchen fires, and hauled trays of silver polished so bright they reflected faces back in warped mockery. Each movement was silent choreography learned by necessity. Serve fast, serve quiet, leave no trace. Above it all hung the contradictions that Charleston was built upon. In the city, men read speeches about liberty. On the plantation, liberty was locked away behind iron, traded in ledgers beaten into silence. The house loomed like a stage lit for performance, but beneath its boards the ground swelled with restless memory. The atmosphere that July night was heavy, not just with heat, but with waiting. Something in the air pressed against the skin, like the pause before a storm or the breath held just before a verdict. Samuel stood at the center of the kitchen's fire, though most never noticed him. To the masters, he was a fixture of the house, no different than the iron stove or the worn brick walls. He had cooked their meals for years, breakfasts before dawn hunts, suppers after long evenings of cards, grand feasts when politics demanded spectacle. They praised the taste of his roasts, the crispness of his corn cakes, the sweetness of his sauces, never once tasting the bitterness that clung to his silence. He spoke little, answered quickly, and bowed his head when ordered. That was the mask. Silence was his shield. The masters mistook it for submission, never suspecting that behind Samuel's quiet eyes lived a ledger. Each cruelty was written there in ink only he could read. He carried the memory of lashes that cut into his back, of men who laughed while others starved, of the little boy he buried in secret. The book inside him had grown heavy over years, and every page turned toward the same conclusion. Samuel was not large, nor did he carry the brute strength overseers prized in field hands. His strength lay elsewhere, in patience, in calculation, in the long hours he spent grinding spices and herbs into powders. He knew the plants that numbed the tongue, the roots that twisted the stomach, the leaves that stilled the heart. Knowledge passed down from women who whispered while they worked, ancestors who hid wisdom in lullabies so it would not be beaten out. In the kitchen his hands appeared only busy, but his mind weighed every detail. Which goblet each master favored, which dish they demanded, how much wine it took before their boasts drowned caution. He knew who leaned heavy on the pork, who sopped bread in stew, who drained their glass to the bottom. Knowledge was power, and Samuel had collected it grain by grain like a miser hoarding coin. If asked, he would have said nothing. He had learned long ago that words could betray as swiftly as hands. His disguise was obedience. Every nod, every bowed shoulder, every careful "yes, master," another stitch in the cloak that kept suspicion away. But under that cloak a weapon gleamed sharp and waiting. It was not a knife, nor a musket, nor a torch. It was patience honed into something harder than steel. And on this night of fireworks and drunken liberty, Samuel's patience had finally found its appointed hour. 12 men gathered in the Middleton house that night, each seated high as if the table itself were an altar and they its gods. Together they represented Charleston's power, planters swollen with tobacco wealth, merchants who grew fat on human cargo, militia officers with polished sabers, and politicians whose mouths spilled liberty while their hands shackled it. They called themselves patriots, heirs of 1776. Yet to those who served them, they were simply 12 faces of the same cruelty. Colonel Rutledge was the loudest, his voice a cannon blast. He wore medals from campaigns against Seminole villages, boasting of battles that were massacres. He was known to whip slaves bloody for failing to salute him properly, his pride demanding obedience sharper than any blade. Beside him sat Judge Harrison, whose pen had signed away countless lives. He prided himself on order and law, yet in private, he prowled the slave quarters at night, choosing young girls to violate under threat of silence. His robes of justice were stained in secret. Merchant Green, plump and ruddy, had built his fortune shipping rice to Europe and black flesh to Cuba. He laughed the loudest, his mouth red from wine, his fingers heavy with rings bought by other men's broken backs. Green once wagered a boy's life in a card game and lost. Samuel remembered the screams. Captain Drayton, militia officer, arrived in uniform though no war was called for. He carried his saber even to supper, and his pleasure was drilling slaves like soldiers, forcing them to march barefoot through cane fields until their skin peeled. His devotion to discipline was another mask for cruelty. Others filled the seats. Reverend Clark, who thundered sermons of obedience on Sunday, then sold infants from their mothers' arms on Monday. Mr. Ellery, who prided himself on scientific breeding, pairing men and women like livestock to fatten his profits. Banker Whitman, whose ledgers treated human bodies as collateral. Sheriff Calhoun, who hunted runaways with hounds, chaining their corpses to crossroads as warnings. And more, their names less important than the weight of their sins. 12 in all, men who cloaked themselves in honor and festivity, yet left scars deeper than any war. That night they lifted goblets high, faces shining in candlelight, boasting of freedom's triumph over tyranny. But Samuel saw not patriots. He saw executioners in fine coats, hypocrites draped in liberty's flag, men whose cruelty had written his ledger line by line. The 12 believed themselves untouchable, their power eternal. They could not know that the kitchen's silence had already begun to spell their names in poison. The July air hung heavier as the sun sank, pressing down like a lid on a boiling pot. Shadows lengthened across the fields, stretching thin and sharp over the cabins where whispers grew restless. The quarters were alive with hushed talk, words carried quick from mouth to mouth, like sparks leaping from ember to ember. "Something will break tonight," one old woman muttered, clutching a strip of cloth like a charm. She had seen omens all week, dogs howling without reason, the river running dark after rain, and now the sight of a crow perched bold upon the Middleton roof. To her it was not just a bird but a messenger, a spirit come to watch judgment unfold. The slaves who served closer to the house felt it too. They moved with unusual stillness, their eyes lowered but darting when no overseer watched. They saw Samuel at his work, hands deliberate, his face unreadable, and it stirred something unspoken in them. The cook dropped no crumbs that night, left no spills, made no mistakes. It was as if every motion was guided by an unseen hand, each gesture part of a plan larger than any one of them could name. The guests filled the veranda with booming laughter and drunken songs, but beneath it, a strange silence pulsed. Slaves carrying trays of wine and platters of meat found themselves trembling though no whip was raised. It was not fear alone. It was expectation, like standing at the edge of a storm, air so charged it burned in the lungs. Even the land seemed unsettled. The rice fields shivered though no wind stirred. The horses in the stable stamped and snorted, rolling their eyes as if they sensed a fire that had not yet been lit. The smell of smoke from fireworks mixed with the heavy scent of roasting meat until it was hard to tell celebration from sacrifice. Samuel said nothing, yet his silence carried weight enough to bend the air around him. When he lifted a ladle, others glanced away. When he set down a tray, they held their breath. In their bones, they knew a threshold had been crossed. The crow on the roof cawed once, harsh and long, before taking flight into the night. Some swore it circled the house 3 times before vanishing into the dark. Inside, the candles flickered as though stirred by an unseen wind. The feast had not yet begun, but the reckoning had already entered the room. Samuel's silence had not been born in a single night. It was carved into him across years, cut deeper with every loss. His wife, Ruth, was the first wound. She was taken on a humid morning when the rice was high and the field smelled of rot. A trader from Louisiana walked the line of women as if he were inspecting cattle. Ruth was young, strong, and her eyes still held a spark that slavery had not extinguished. That spark made her valuable. Samuel remembered the way she clung to him, the overseer prying her fingers loose as she screamed. He never saw her again, though sometimes in his dreams he still felt the warmth of her hand slipping from his. Their son, Josiah, was the second wound. Barely 10 years old, thin as a reed but quick with laughter. The overseer beat him for stumbling while carrying a bucket too heavy for his frame. The blows did not stop when he fell. Samuel found the boy's body after, lifeless in the dust, the small back striped with welts. No words of mercy were spoken. The earth swallowed Josiah in silence, and Samuel swallowed his grief the same way. His mother was the last wound, though she had been dying for years. Bent and frail, worn down by endless seasons of labor, she carried hunger like a chain around her neck. Samuel watched her body fade until even breath seemed too heavy to lift. When she passed, her eyes were open, fixed on something beyond the rafters. He sat with her until morning alone, remembering the stories she whispered when he was a boy, stories of roots and herbs, of leaves that soothed pain and others that could stop a heart. She had called it survival knowledge, passed from African mothers who hid wisdom in lullabies. From her, Samuel learned that the land itself carried weapons if one knew how to look. The bitter seed, the twisted root, the leaf with veins like scars, most used to heal but some kept secret, were meant to kill. Each loss had been written into Samuel like lines in a book, wife, son, mother, each page stained with a grief that never faded. Tonight he turned the book to its final chapter. He did not raise his voice or bare his teeth. He reached instead for what his mother's whispers had left him, the knowledge of a death that came slow, silent, and certain. The morning of July 4th dawned like any other on the Middleton estate, thick air hanging low, sun already sharp as iron by the time the slaves were put to work. The house buzzed with preparation for the night's feast. Wagons rattled in with barrels of wine, baskets of peaches, crates of tobacco. In the kitchen, Samuel kept his steady rhythm, eyes lowered, hands quiet. Yet outside the open door, a moment was about to etch itself into his bones forever. A young girl no more than 12 was tasked with carrying a tray of goblets across the veranda. The silver weighed heavy in her small arms, her body thin from hunger, her steps stumbling on the sun-scorched boards. Sweat ran down her temples, soaking into the rough linen at her collar. She swayed once, twice, then her knees buckled. The tray crashed to the ground, crystal goblets shattering into a dozen glittering shards. The sound drew the masters. From their chairs they leaned forward, their faces curdled with amusement. Colonel Rutledge barked a laugh so loud it startled the dogs tied near the porch. Merchant Green slapped his knee, wine already staining his chin. Freedom, one of them jeered, raising his glass. See how it suits them, another quipped. Liberty lays them flat quicker than the lash. Their laughter cracked across the veranda like whips. The girl did not move. She lay crumpled in the heat, breath shallow, her thin chest rising only faintly. An overseer walked over, grabbed her by the wrists, and dragged her limp body aside, tossing her beneath the shadow of a pillar as if discarding waste. No water, no care, no pause. The feast preparations continued as though nothing had happened. Samuel watched from the kitchen doorway. His face revealed nothing, but inside something broke. He had endured loss before, swallowed grief until it hardened like stone. But this small life mocked and thrown away was the last crack his silence could bear. In the sound of their laughter he heard his wife's cries, his son's last breath, his mother's hunger. He heard the echo of every name stolen, every body broken. The tray of goblets lay shattered in sunlight, shards glittering red where drops of spilled wine caught the morning light. To Samuel it looked like blood across the veranda floor. He turned back into the kitchen without a word, but his patience, his weapon, had reached its edge. That morning, as the house roared with laughter at freedom, Samuel chose judgment. The kitchen swelled with heat, hotter than the July sun outside, flames licking iron pots until the air shimmered. Sweat rolled down Samuel's temples, but he never slowed. To the others he looked as he always did, focused, steady, wordless in his labor. Only Samuel knew what else brewed among the smoke and steam. He drew the herbs from a pouch hidden deep in the folds of cloth, wrapped carefully as if they were sacred relics. Roots dried to twisted shapes, leaves veined black, seeds sharp as splinters. His mother had whispered their names to him in hushed tones when he was a boy, warning that knowledge was both shield and blade. Tonight that blade would cut. Samuel worked with ritual precision. He ground the roots with a stone pestle, each strike muffled, steady. He poured water from the well, stirred until the mixture frothed pale, then strained it through cloth, catching the bitter essence that seeped like ink. As he worked, he whispered, not prayers the masters would understand, but words older, carried across oceans in the mouths of the stolen. He spoke to his ancestors, to Ruth, to Josiah, to his mother. Guide my hand, steady my will. The kitchen's noise masked his work. Pans clattered, knives chopped, servants bustled. No one noticed when he tipped a ladle of dark liquid into the glaze for the roasted pig, stirring until it shimmered like honey. No one saw when he poured a vial into the casks of red wine, the liquid swirling, swallowing death without protest. The poison slipped into the feast as easily as salt into stew. Samuel's hands trembled once when he set the ladle down. For a heartbeat he saw Josiah's face, wide-eyed and grinning, then broken and still. The tremor passed. His face returned to stone, unreadable as ever. Trays were polished, goblets lined, the roasted pig gleaming under its glaze. The meal looked a celebration of abundance, of liberty and power. But Samuel knew each dish was an offering, each goblet a chalice of judgment. When he carried the platters to the waiting table, his steps were sure, his expression calm. To the 12, he was nothing but a cook serving their glory. To Samuel, he was the hand of silence, delivering what the lash, the rope, and the grave could never erase. The feast was ready. The hour of freedom had arrived, not theirs but his. The feast began with noise fit for a battlefield. Fireworks cracked above the Middleton estate, painting the night in fleeting red and white. Inside the grand hall, 12 men raised their goblets high, toasting liberty with voices that rattled the chandeliers. Candles flared along the table, their flames mirrored in silver platters heavy with food. The roasted pig glistened, golden skin lacquered with glaze. Decanters of wine shimmered ruby beneath the glow. Samuel moved quietly among them, setting down trays, filling glasses, head bowed as always. To the masters he was invisible. To Samuel every motion was a strike, each goblet filled was a noose. Each slice carved from the pig was a shovel of earth on their graves. The first hour rang with drunken boasting. Colonel Rutledge bragged of whipping a runaway until his back sang hymns. Judge Harrison told a crude story of a girl dragged from the quarters. Laughter burst like musket fire, spilling wine onto polished linen. Outside, rockets screamed upward, exploding over the harbor. Inside, the true fireworks waited in silence. It began with Green, the merchant. He was still laughing when his face blanched, the chuckle catching in his throat. He coughed once, twice, the sound harsh, then clawed at his collar as though invisible hands tightened around his neck. The others jeered at first, too much wine, Green, until the red foam appeared at his lips. Silence dropped like a curtain. Then came Captain Drayton, rising from his chair, staggering as the saber at his side clattered to the floor. His hands trembled, reaching for balance, but his legs gave way, spilling him across the table. Platters crashed, candles toppled. Wine mixed with blood-colored froth, dripping onto the floor. One by one, the 12 began to choke. Reverend Clark's psalm turned into a strangled moan. Sheriff Calhoun slammed his fists against the table, eyes bulging before he toppled sideways, chair snapping beneath his weight. Banker Whitman vomited dark fluid onto his ledger notes, the ink running like rivers of black bile. The hall erupted into chaos. Guests shrieked, servants fled, slaves pressed themselves against the walls in horrified silence. Only Samuel stood still, hands folded, face calm as stone. Judge Harrison tried to crawl across the table, blood streaming from his mouth. He reached for Samuel, lips forming words he could no longer speak. Samuel did not move. The judge's hand fell inches from the cook's apron, his body shuddering once before going still. One by one, the 12 voices of Charleston fell silent. Laughter turned to gasps, boasting to rattled breath, and finally to nothing. Fireworks still thundered outside, the sky alive with light, but inside the hall the only sound was the choking death of men who had feasted on freedom while starving others of it. Samuel lowered his eyes, the ledger inside him closing at last. 12 names crossed out in silence. Judgment served. The great hall was a ruin of overturned chairs and broken platters, the air thick with smoke from toppled candles and the stench of vomit, wine, and death. The 12 masters lay sprawled in grotesque shapes across the table and floor, their fine coats stained dark, their mouths frozen in the last contortions of pain. Goblets rolled from limp hands, spilling what was left of poisoned wine into pools that gleamed like blood in the candlelight. Panic erupted beyond the walls. Guests who had lingered on the veranda bolted into the night, their shouts echoing across the estate. Murder, they cried. Poison, horses whinnied, wagons clattered, women screamed until their throats broke. The thunder of fireworks in the harbor was drowned beneath the terror of Charleston's finest fleeing from a ghost they could not see. Inside, overseers stormed through the hall, their whips hanging useless at their sides. They stared at the bodies, faces gone pale, and their voices dropped to trembling whispers. Who did this? The answer came not in shouts but in murmurs, carried by the slaves pressed against the walls. It was Samuel, they breathed, almost reverent, not accusation, not betrayal, just truth. Soldiers were summoned, their boots pounding like war drums as they poured onto the estate. Torches flared, throwing cruel light across the grounds. They dragged the dead into rows, the bodies of Charleston's pillars of power lined like cattle before slaughter. The flames flickered over their faces, highlighting the silence Samuel had bought. Amid the frenzy, some of the enslaved slipped into the night. A door left unguarded, a gate ajar, shadows moving through the rice fields under cover of chaos. The confusion was their shield, the screams their distraction. For the first time, the stars above seemed to guide them not back to chains, but toward something like freedom. Others remained, too afraid or too bound by family to risk flight. They watched the hall fill with soldiers, torches, and suspicion, and they whispered Samuel's name again, not as a curse, but as a story that would live beyond this night. The estate blazed with torchlight until it looked less like a house of celebration and more like a battlefield, the dead displayed as trophies of a war no one had declared but Samuel had begun. In the center of it all, Samuel stood silent, his face unreadable. Around him, the world screamed and burned, but his vengeance was complete. 12 voices of power were gone, and Charleston would never forget the night Liberty's feast turned to silence. Samuel did not run. While others slipped into the night, he stood where the soldiers found him, in the wreckage of the kitchen, hands folded, face calm. They seized him with shouts and blows, but he offered no struggle. Shackles bit into his wrists, chains heavy against his ankles, yet he walked without falter, his silence heavier than iron. In Charleston, the court convened quickly. The city demanded blood, for 12 of its most powerful men had been struck down on the very night of their celebration. The courtroom reeked of fear as much as anger. Spectators filled the benches, their voices buzzing like hornets. They wanted to see the monster who had dared touch Liberty's chosen. Samuel stood alone before the judges, shoulders straight, eyes steady. The charges were read: murder, treason, rebellion. The prosecutor spat his words, calling Samuel a demon, a coward who used poison instead of steel. But Samuel never spoke, no plea, no defense, not even when offered the chance to beg for mercy. His silence unnerved them more than any confession. It was as if he stood not accused, but already beyond their reach. Witnesses were paraded before the court, overseers, guests, even trembling slaves forced to speak his name. Still Samuel held his tongue. Some swore they saw his lips twitch, not in fear but in something closer to satisfaction. The verdict was swift, death by hanging, the date set without hesitation. The city wanted spectacle, a warning carved into memory. On the morning of the execution, the square filled with people, planters, merchants, soldiers, slaves brought under guard. A gallows loomed tall against the sky, rope swinging like a promise. Samuel was led forward, his steps measured, his face as calm as when he stirred pots over fire. The crowd shouted curses, but none pierced him. When the hood was offered, he refused. He wanted Charleston to see his face. The noose was placed around his neck. The hangman asked if he had final words. Samuel opened his mouth, but nothing came, only silence, heavy, defiant, eternal. Yet those closest swore they saw it, a faint curve at the corner of his lips, the ghost of a smile. And when the trapdoor fell, some whispered his lips were still stained dark, as if he carried the taste of poison even into death. The body swung above the square, but the silence below was louder. Samuel had said nothing, yet his final answer thundered through Charleston: judgment cannot be buried. Decades passed, but the memory of that night never loosened its grip on Charleston. The Middleton estate fell into ruin, its columns cracked, its windows dark, the once proud house left to rot beneath the weight of silence. Travelers who crossed the grounds said the earth itself carried the memory of vengeance. Some swore the soil grew barren where the 12 masters had feasted, as though the land refused to nourish anything touched by their shadows. Locals called it cursed ground. Even children, daring each other to step too close, turned pale when the wind shifted. For on every 4th of July the air carried a strange bitterness, an acrid scent like scorched herbs, sharp enough to sting the throat. It drifted through the rice fields, rolled down the river, clung to the ruined kitchen walls. The elders said it was Samuel's hand still stirring, his poison carried on the wind. At night, when fireworks flared over Charleston, the stories deepened. Some claimed they heard choking carried through the dark, 12 voices gasping in unison, clawing for air though no bodies remained. Dogs refused to cross the estate's gates on those nights, howling and pulling at their leashes. Horses reared, eyes rolling, as if they smelled something their riders could not. The hearth in the old kitchen was the heart of the tale. Stones blackened by decades of fire still stood, though the roof above had long collapsed. Travelers who lingered swore they saw a figure there, the outline of a man, head bowed, ladle in hand, stirring a pot that no longer existed. His shadow moved though no flame burned, and the air grew heavy with the scent of bitter leaves. Others spoke of Samuel's smile. In the square where he had been hanged, people claimed that when the dawn light struck the gallows post, a faint curve appeared carved into the wood, as if a smile had been etched by rope and time. Superstition clung to the image, a warning or perhaps a promise. Families told the story in whispers, passing it down like scripture. Samuel of Charleston, they said, the cook who silenced 12 men on the night of freedom. His tale became a weapon carried in memory. For every child who heard it, the 4th of July carried not only fireworks and parades, but also the reminder that liberty had been poisoned by hypocrisy, and that silence, once sharpened, could speak louder than cannons. Even now, when the wind shifts over Charleston's ruins, some claim to hear the faint clatter of goblets tipping, the last gasps of men who toasted liberty and swallowed judgment instead. And always, just at the edge of sight, the shadow of a cook lingers by the hearth, silent, patient, stirring forever. They called it independence, but for Samuel and countless others there was no freedom, only chains. On that night, one man turned silence into judgment. What about you when you hear stories like Samuel's? Do you feel the echoes of our ancestors' pain, their strength, their fight for dignity? If Samuel's story moved you, if it made you remember those whose names history tried to erase, then honor them with us. Like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so their voices will never be silenced again.